This is Data Community United for Ukraine. As usual, we are testing our sound. So if you can hear us in YouTube, LinkedIn, or any other networks, just let us know, typing that the sound is fine. We are testing it on our side, but we appreciate your help.
All good.
YouTube, LinkedIn, or any.
It is alive.
Yes, it is alive. Just let me turn off additional outputs since I cannot find where I am online. Okay, hello again. This is Bogdan Maharos and Data Community United for Ukraine, and thank you for coming today. Today is our 7th day of the conference marathon, taking 3 weeks, 9 amazing speakers, and speakers all over the world. And all that is about business intelligence, about Power BI, data science, clouds, and a lot of other very interesting technical things. And as you know, not only technical. So during our sessions, we are collecting funds for our Marine units, the guys who are defending our country everywhere. And as you know, Marine units are working in the hottest places in Ukraine. So the thing is, they need an additional equipment, and we are collecting funds for a drone, Mavic 3, and people from Ukraine know it very well. So now we have almost half of the price for that, and the price is about $3,600 dollars for that, and we almost have the half of the price. So don't hesitate to donate. All funds are going directly into one of the biggest Ukrainian charity foundation, Come Back Alive, which in Ukrainian we call Poverny Živim. So a lot of people know it, and you can track the collection progress. So everything is transparent, so you can see everything on your side. So you know that the copters are the eyes for our army, so it's very important for for them. And any even very small donation could be an important investment for our defenders. All of them have to come back alive when the war is over, and this is the thing that support them very well. And as I said, the conference takes 3 weeks, and you can watch us from different platforms like YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. But if you press notify button on our YouTube channel or press subscribe, so it helps you not to miss our events and to be notified if we start the stream. So, and usually on the under the video in YouTube, in the description section, you can see the registration form for Eventbrite platform, and we are also raffling nice gifts for the participants who are registered on the Eventbrite. So don't hesitate to register, and we have some nice gifts. And today we have a lot of people joining our session as usual. We have Melissa Coates, a very amazing speaker. We'll introduce her a bit like in a few seconds. We also have Ricardo Cabral, Andrea Melancia, and Diane Sarka, who are usually coming to support us, to be with us. And thank you for being with us. And Andrea, if you words, or Nothing today?
So we're going into the last week of our nice marathon to raise some funds for Ukraine. Please contribute. This last week is going to be our last one, but you can still contribute if you haven't done so already. And thank you all for participating in this and raising money to help Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you. And this week is total Power BI week, nothing except Power BI. We'll talk about Power BI 3 days, and today we have Melissa Coates, an amazing speaker. You can remember Melissa from our previous sessions from Power BI on Air, and Melissa is the owner of the Coates Data Strategies. Her current professional focus is the enterprise level Power BI governance, deployment, security, and administration. And Melissa is the creator of the Power BI deployment and governance online course, and she is the principal author of the Microsoft Power BI adoption roadmap. It's very interesting. And she's a co-author of the Planning a Power BI enterprise deployment white paper. So if you want to know a lot about administration, you should watch Melissa. She knows that, and she knows a lot about it. Melissa, your turn. What we're going to talk about today?
Well, hi, thanks for having me. And we are going to talk today about security in Power BI. So if you would like a copy of the materials that you're about to see on my website, which is cotesdatastrategies.com, or you can use cotesds.com for short. On the presentations page, you will be able to grab these materials if you would like to have them. Thank you for that nice introduction. I have absolutely nothing to add. Here are some additional links to finding more information about me. I guess the only thing I will add is that enterprise deployment white paper that you mentioned, that's the one I co-authored with Chris Webb, who is talking in this conference tomorrow. We are updating and replacing all of that content in something called Power BI implementation planning. So if anybody's interested, we can talk more about that at the end. But here's what we have planned for today's session. All about security with a focus on the Power BI service. Basically, I'm going to start with a bit of an overview. We're going to talk about these layers of security. And then we're basically going to step through some of the key pieces of security: workspaces, sharing, apps, row-level security. We're going to tie it all together towards the end with some suggestions and strategies. At each one of these sections, we can pause, see if there are any clarifying questions. So I'm going to rely on Bodan and others to help field those questions for me. I do want to mention this is a fast, almost intermediate session. I am not covering all of the fundamentals in detail. And I mention that so that if you need me to elaborate on exactly what I mean by something, feel free to pop that in whichever platform you're in, and we'll do our best to kind of double back. Now, security is a massive, massive topic. There are a whole bunch of aspects of security that are not in scope for this session. So just as a frame of reference, that there's a bunch more stuff to learn that we just don't have time to cover here today. All right, let's jump in with just a few concepts and some terms that you are going to hear from me in this session. So we have two types of workspaces. There is a personal workspace and a standard workspace, or just a regular workspace. I always want to qualify it. These here used to be called app workspace, and Microsoft has stopped calling them that, and I still have this tendency to want to qualify them. But we have these two places to store content. So the primary purpose of a workspace is to store content and things like data sets and reports like I'm showing here. But it is more than that. One of the biggest purposes of a workspace is to allow people to collaborate on content. Here I'm showing a data model owner and a report owner and a tester and that sort of thing. And where you see me going with this is as we start to get more people involved, there are security implications, of course, when we need to use this platform to collaborate. We can also use a workspace as a way to distribute content for very small and informal teams. And if you don't quite get what I mean by that, I promise you will throughout the course of this session. So you just heard me say collaborate, distribute. Let's clarify exactly what I mean by these terms. Sharing can really be used two ways. It's literally a feature in the Power BI service. And I've started calling it, and the Power BI team has started calling it per item sharing. And that's really the key here. And we're going to talk about securing sets of items versus individual items. But watch out for how people use the term sharing, because they might be literally talking about the feature, or they might just be speaking generally as in, share that with you, but they're going to use a different mechanism than the literal feature. So just kind of watch out for that so there aren't misunderstandings. When we say distribute content, that's really just a general term for delivering content. And by the way, I didn't make up these these terms. These are how the Power BI team sees the world. This is how it was explained to me by a product manager a couple of years ago. So these aren't Melissa terms. So usually if we're talking about distributing content, we're talking about an app, but really it's just a general term. And collaboration, just a general term for people working together. People can do that just in Power BI desktop in a file, or they can use a workspace for that kind of thing. We've got all of these different ways for people to view content. Our two workspaces, an app, or the per item sharing. So they each basically have their own strength and what they do best and when they're best suited to be used. And this is a security session, right? So we're not really going to focus heavily on that. But before I just jump 3 steps ahead, it's worth mentioning that really the primary purpose for each one of these things, if we're in a personal workspace, it's really just personal BI we should be doing. We'll talk more about that in a minute. If we're in a standard workspace, we should be doing team collaboration type of work. If we're using an app, we're usually talking more about broad content distribution. And if we are using the sharing feature, we're usually talking about distributing one individual item like a report. And we're going to elaborate on all of this in the remainder of the session. That's just a little bit of level setting in terms you're going to hear from me. Now, the other thing that's a little bit of a factor, and the last thing that I want to cover before we jump into the security side, is this idea of content ownership, because it has a huge implication on security, which means it has a huge implication in how you decide to use the Power BI service. So over here on the far left, we are saying that the business owns and manages all of the content, and that is the data and the reports, right? On the far right, we're saying that some sort of enterprise BI team, or maybe even an IT team or your center of excellence, is owning and managing the data and the reports. We like to say managed self-service BI, or this blended approach, is the ideal because the data is centralized and the reports are decentralized. And that is all absolutely true. What I'm here to tell you is that those patterns can be used by, even if we're doing business-led self-service BI on the left, the same patterns can be used. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the data is owned by IT or the BI team for you to use those managed self-service BI patterns. But as you tackle these sorts of things, that will influence your workspace's approach, your app's approach, the security you set for them, et cetera, et cetera. It's a twisty set of decisions for sure. I'll pause and check for questions as soon as we cover this section here, because this is our last little quick overview session. So here I just want to introduce this idea that there are layers of security. So just to make sure you're with me before we start to go deeper on each section. The first thing that we want to think about is that when we can, we want to set permissions on a set of artifacts. And in the service, there's basically two ways we can do this. The first one is if we use workspace roles, and we have these 4 roles: admin, member, contributor, viewer. 3 of them allow you to edit at different permission levels. 1 of them allows you to view only. I said earlier, we aren't going into gory details on these fundamentals, so hopefully that's a familiar concept to you. The app is the other way to set permissions for a set of artifacts. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the apps section, especially the new audiences feature, which is very cool, and I'm going to demo that for you as well. Apps are always read or view only permissions. The thing is, these are the 2 ways that we set permissions at a set level. But an app truly is a separate level of permissions. It's never inherited from the workspace. It is truly set separately. And that's a really important concept because other stuff is inherited. So if we move on to per item permissions, let's say we've got individual items like a data set or a report, for instance, okay? When we want to set per item permissions is when we want to truly impact one and only one item. So per item permissions can be assigned directly, for instance, to this report if you wanted to, for instance, provide read permissions to it. They're also inherited from either workspace roles or app permissions. So very important concept there as far as getting permissions that are inherited. And as we go through the demos, you're going to spot some of that that's happening. So we've talked about the set. We've talked about the per item. And if we go now to our 3rd layer, almost a 3rd layer of defense, you could think about it. And that is when we start to think about something like row level security or object level security. And the idea here is that you've got the same set of data that shows different data to different people based on what they're allowed to see. Maybe person A is allowed to see the East region and person B is allowed to see the West region. And so we're going to talk more about RLS towards the end of this session, but think of that as your 3rd layer that does something different than the access permissions that we talked about earlier. So we might have the set of artifacts, the one artifact, or the different data results, kind of those 3 layers we just talked about. And then we have all these different types of users: who authors data, who authors reports, and who consumes content. So you have all these different combinations of ways that we can use permissions to satisfy the needs for these different groups of people. And as you would expect, the number of people gets larger as we move left to right on this diagram. Final point is that as we're looking at our 2 types of authors and our consumers, we don't want to make things harder than they need to be. But we do want to follow the principle of least privilege, which really just asks, what's the minimum level of security that we can set that won't prevent someone from doing their job? And when we get into looking at some demos, the way the Power BI service tries to make things very, very easy for everyone, certain things are checked by default, which makes it easy to over-provision permissions sometimes. All right. We're next going to start stepping through workspaces, apps, sharing, etc. Before we do that, are there any high-level questions that we wanted to tackle before we move on?
So no questions so far. The only thing we have is a comment. So someone mentioned that's always loved the slides, referring to the slides about the 3BI content ownership approaches. That's the only thing I have.
Love it. Yeah, I tend to have to bring that up in every single presentation I ever do because it's such a core fundamental concept. And thinking about who owns and manages that content, also along with who's going to view and use the content, just factors in so heavily to how we make decisions. All right, so before we talk about personal workspaces, in the Power BI service, all of us, each one of us have what we would think of as a personal workspace, or translated in the English language, my workspace. So this is where we can publish content. An administrator can't turn this off. So this is available to every individual person, but only one person, the owner of the workspace, can manage content here. So using my workspace is a good alternative to if someone, for instance, was just sharing PBIX files on a file system. It is a good advancement from that, but it is really only used for, or best used, I should say, for certain kind of situations, those personal projects that you have, or if you're working on a proof of concept or something temporary that isn't ready to get published out to a standard workspace. Now, you might also have a development standard workspace where you do this kind of stuff, and that's okay too. But this should be kind of your private area. The big takeaways for personal workspaces that I want you to know is that mission critical content should not be there. Although we can share content from my workspace, we shouldn't in most cases. And that's really because only one owner can manage that. Now, there is an item on the release plan, and currently we are in the year 2022 release wave 2. There is an item here that is going to allow a Power BI administrator to add or remove themselves as an admin of anyone's personal workspace. So when this lands, which it looks like public preview is targeted to December, when this lands, this idea of allowing a personal workspace that is truly private and nobody else can see it is going to go away. I see a question from Bodan. Thank you for putting it in the chat where I can see it. And he says, can an administrator in an organization see if we have something published in our personal workspace? And the answer is absolutely yes. If I pop over to the admin portal, and there is a workspaces area here. And if I sort this just by type to get a personal one here, let's see what Peyton is my main demo user. The admin here without even running APIs, right? So there are admin APIs where you can basically get a tenant metadata list, right, of what's published where and by whom. We can also see it directly here, you know, without querying the data in that manner. As it stands right now, the admin, unless they have permission to read it, they can't go actually view this report and they can't download it. But when this release plan item hits, that's going to change, right? They're going to become an admin of the personal workspace as well. So in general, that's going to be a good thing to be able to rescue content for people that, you know, a self-service user that has started using the Power BI service, the personal workspace was right there, they started using it, and they just don't know yet about better ways to get things done. All right, moving on to standard workspaces. When we're talking about a standard workspace, here's where we want to organize our content so that we can organize it by subject area, or we can set it up for different development test production. For instance, we might also separate out data and reporting workspaces separately, all those sorts of things. There is a set of guidance called, well, let me backtrack a second. The Power BI Adoption Roadmap is something that Bodan mentioned at the beginning. Matthew Roche and I authored that. It's got a lot of really helpful information. We are now in the middle of publishing something that's called Power BI Implementation Planning. And it's a work in progress. We're publishing one section at a time. And one of the things that I think you'll find most helpful is the workspace planning guidance. So just a heads up that this content is there. Information protection just landed a few days ago. Security, that one's coming. It's in the middle of being written right now. So probably be there in, about a month. And I see the question about, can we disable the use of personal workspaces? Nope, you cannot disable it. The best thing you can do is you can teach your users how to use personal workspaces effectively. All right, so we have, let's say conceptually, a couple different data workspaces. One that we say is going to store data flows and one that's going to store data sets. Now I'm going to tell you in a minute why this is a pattern you might want to follow. And then I've got some reporting workspaces on the right. And doing these types of things really helps when you have different sets of people who develop and maintain these types of content, or who are responsible for managing the content. So we fundamentally need different security so that every single person that's allowed to publish a report can't also overwrite all the data sets, right? That doesn't follow the principle of least privilege. So if we think first about our data authors, and those are our people that create data sets, data flows, and data marts. Here I'm just showing one data set to keep it simple. And they would have on this data workspace, they would have a workspace role of admin member or contributor. Or they would have the new write permission on the individual data set. So we're going to talk more about that later, but just to clarify now what that is, because this write permission is very new. So I like to organize and structure workspaces where we can say the set of content in this workspace is secured in a certain way. But there are people that are of the opinion, it's not wrong, right? In IT, there's 18 different ways that we can do any of this stuff, right? But it's not my favorite way to do things. But some people like to have data workspaces that have a lot of different data sets in those workspaces. And then what you could do is use this new write permission on each individual data set to manage it that way instead of the workspace role. Because if you remember, the workspace roles always affect everything in the entire workspace. So think of the per item permissions as an exception to workspace security. All right, so the data author has permission on the data workspace. Moving to your report authors, these are your folks that create reports and visuals, right? So they need to be able to query that data, but we don't want them to be able to overwrite that data set because they're not responsible for managing it. So the first thing that they would need is a workspace role down here on the report workspace. So same thing as before, admin member or contributor, depending on what you want them to be able to do. And then here's where the magic happens. They get the build permission on the individual data set over in the data workspace. That is a per item permission. So I do realize the inconsistency of what I just said and what I'm about to say, build is always set on the individual data set. So on the data set, if someone has a workspace role of admin member contributor, build is already implicit because you can read it and edit it. But if you only have read on the data set, build is an additional item to it. So this is how you would accomplish not over provisioning permissions for people that only need to produce reports. Advantages of this: A, you have clarity on who's responsible for what, right? Who's allowed to edit this, who's allowed to view that. So it helps us from a roles and responsibilities perspective. Means we don't have to rely on the honor system that somebody says, I promise I'm only going to touch the reports. I will never touch the data set. And in some small teams, that might be just fine. You don't need to make it harder than it needs to be. But if we are trying to accomplish managed self-service BI, that middle column that we started with a few minutes ago, this is a great way to make that happen. And then also, we haven't talked about row-level security yet, but if you're trying to make row-level security work for your report authors, the fact that they only have read and build on that data set over in another workspace, yet they have all full edit permissions down in their report workspace, means row-level security works for your data or for your report authors. And that's a very, very big deal. On my website, I've got a whole bunch of workspace planning criteria. I'm not going to take time to review them now, but fundamentally, we want to think about what's the content, who's it being delivered to, who is going to manage it, and how are we going to deploy it. So you can see that security type things kind of traverse these multiple categories. There's a link to the blog post there. But that's kind of a good set of criteria to help you figure out, gee, when do I need one workspace versus multiple workspaces? We have our 4 roles. Think of the admin member contributor as roles that align very well with people who need to collaborate. So they're the ones doing editing, testing, or deployments. And then that viewer role is okay if you've got a small informal team. If you don't need the extra overhead of an app, which we're going to talk about here in a couple minutes, that's okay. If you just have 7 people on your team, 2 of your managers need to view a couple of reports. If you want to have an app, that's fine. If you want to keep it simple and use the viewer role in a workspace, it's fine too. All right. Those 4 roles we just mentioned, there are 2 exceptions to those roles that I do want you to know about. The first one is actually in the workspace setting. So if I pop back over here and let me just go to Sales Analytics Workspace and I go to Settings and we expand Advanced down here at the bottom, this is a security setting that's in the workspace. And it basically says, oh, contributors, you get to do this one more thing within the scope of this workspace only, and it allows them to update an existing app. So it means that you're a contributor and you're not going to get to do everything a member can do, but you can do this one more thing. So that's one thing to know about that workspace by workspace could make the experience slightly different. And then there's this tenant setting that's called block republish and disable package refresh, which is a very confusing sounding name. What this does is it says only the data set owner is going to be able to publish or overwrite an existing data set. So everything we just talked about was, oh, you need a workspace role or you need that data set write permission. At no point did I say, if I pop over to a data workspace and we go to the settings, and we go look at a data set. This data set has been configured by, that's my demo user junk account. That's the data set owner. So if you were to enable this tenant setting that I'm talking about, only that one person is going to be able to overwrite the data set. So even if you have those other permissions we talked about, they'll be ignored. Now it's just a speed bump. Means you got to go to take over the data set as the owner, and you would have seen that takeover experience before if you wanted to, say, change something about scheduled refresh, right? And then it'll force you to put in credentials again, depending on how you have it set up, right? If you're pointing to a gateway, it won't. But you can take over the data set ownership if you have the workspace role to be able to do it. So it's just a speed bump. This setting applies to the entire org. It is not workspace by workspace or even data set by data set. So I don't recommend using it unless you just really need to be very, very, very careful with who edits data sets, in which case you have this obligation to teach people that create content in the org what to expect so they're not confused. All right, to wrap up this section, watch out for having too many people who have workspace edit roles. I still remember getting acquainted with a new client. I'm looking around their Power BI environment and I see something like 50 workspace admins in a workspace. And I had to put on my diplomacy hat to ask, what in the heck are you doing? So that just increases your risk that unintended things are going to happen. So, try not to do that. Workspaces that are broadly defined and you put a lot of unrelated content in there, the more that you do that, the more you'll have to rely on per item sharing because you can't rely on the workspace or the set-based options for a workspace or an app since you have all this unrelated content. That dataset build permission that we said your report creators will need is automatically inherited for anyone with workspace contributor or above permissions. And row level security is always ignored for people that have those workspace permissions or the dataset write permission. So that's a very, very common source of confusion that, somebody is trying to view it in the service, it's not working, and if you have edit permissions. So again, that's separate data sets, the separate workspaces that we talked about is a great solution to that particular problem. All right, moving on to per item sharing. Before I show you a demo, let me clarify what I mean by sharing, because it's actually changed a lot in the last year and a half or so. We have these two types of sharing. The first one on the left are the sharing links. And then we have what's known as direct access sharing. And the direct access, the one on the right here, is the one we've had for years now. The links are the newer ones. And there are three kinds of links. And let me actually talk about these in a demo. So if we pop back over here to my sales analytics workspace, and let me just go ahead and go to a report. And the very first icon here next to a report is share. Incidentally, that's one big reason why sharing becomes very, very overused, because it's very prominent in the portal and it's very easy for new people to discover it, meaning they start overusing it before they figure out there are better ways. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of this session. All right, the default sharing experience now is this link. Now, I have permission in the tenant setting to do this. So I see this right here is the default, which is people in your organization. Do you know what this is? This is everyone in your organization. This is a very, very broad default. I do not like this default. I think you should turn this off in the tenant settings. And I don't get excitable about turning off a lot of things in the tenant settings, but this one I do. What I think should be the default is specific people. This third one is the one where you say this user or this group gets to view this report. The middle one here, people with existing access, that's actually not a new link. What it does is it just gives you a URL that you can send to somebody because they already had access. So really only the first and the third ones are legit. So turn off this one if you have the power to do so. There is a tenant setting, and that will force this to become the default. Notice that there is a reshare option that comes along with this as a default. So that's something that I recommend turning off a good bit of the time, because what happens is, oh, I share this report out to Sally. I'm going to grant Sally the option to turn around and share it to whoever she sees fit. It might be perfectly appropriate and it might not. Again, Power BI has the mentality of let's make it as easy as possible to share content with other people. And then here, it's not on by default, which is good. Allow recipients to build content with data associated with this report. What that means is it would go and it would add the build permission on the underlying data set. We're going to talk more about that here in a second. But first, so you saw that that's a new sharing link. If I go to manage permissions for this same report, here's an existing link. I can also go to direct access. Here's where we start to see a lot of these items that are inherited from the workspace. So you can see, I neglected to tell you this while we were in workspace section, but for instance, here, my viewers, they align, a group aligns with the workspace viewer role, right? So you can see I have 4 security groups, each set up for each of those roles. And that is sometimes easy to do in your organization and sometimes exceedingly hard to do, depending on how hard it is to get a new group created. So lots of considerations there. The specific per item sharing here, I could add a user here. If I go back to links though, I can add one here as well. And then that gives me the exact same thing that I saw a second ago out from the other experience. Now, while we're in here, let's talk about pending requests for a second. If I go into, I'm going to go into, am I in the right? Yeah, I'm in another window signed in as a separate user. Let's say somebody sent Scotty the URL to that report. And what's going to happen if he tries to view that report from the URL he got is, well, let's get you permission to view this report. So, you know, he says, okay, and he puts in his lovely little message that, you know, here's why I want access, and he sends off his request, right? All right, so let me go back to the window I just was in. I'm going to hit refresh. And on our pending page, what we're going to see is that Scotty asked for access. And we can see the message that he sent. So from here, if I select it, I can approve or decline. So as a quick aside, if you are trying to accomplish managing permissions through groups rather than individuals, the person processing this request would have the responsibility of saying, oh, you know what? I actually need to decline this request and instead go add them to the proper group. So all of the workflows for pending requests, they always use per item sharing. So watch out for that depending on how you're trying to accomplish permissions, because generally speaking, when we can use a group instead of a person, that is a very good idea. Now, before we move on, let me go and look at a data set very quickly. So if I go back to my sales data workspace, and let's use the call center data set. That one doesn't actually have a share icon next to it like the report did. If I go to manage permissions, let me start with links. You know what we see here? We see the same link that was generated when somebody created the link to share the report. Because what happens when you share a report is it also grants read access to the data set underneath. For us to be able to view a report, we have to also be able to read the data. So this is basically an inherited link. Notice that if I go to the top here, I can't create a new link here from the data set. I can only create it from the report. So that's another clue that this is inherited from that report link. Now, if I go over to direct access for the data set, I can indeed add a user. Now, here's where things get really interesting. In addition to everything is checked. So allow recipients to modify. That's the new individual right permission that just got released in sometime in the last month, this fall. And so it used to be that in order to be able to modify a data set, you had to have workspace permissions. And now you can do it on an individual basis. It's there by default. You gotta watch out for that. Allow recipients to reshare the data set. Again, on by default, watch out for that. Allow building new content. That's that thing we talked about earlier that's targeted to your report creators that may or may not be necessary. So lots and lots of assertive defaults. Last thing I want to show you, if I pop back over to my personal workspace, if I go to something like product sales preliminary analysis, and I look at manage permissions, and I see that this has been shared with one other person, this is a good example of using per item sharing out of my workspace, right? It's a preliminary analysis. I want my colleague to see it. That's perfectly fine to do. If I go back to my workspace and I go find something like Southeast Sales Division monthly totals, and we look at those permissions and we go to direct access. This is a bad example of sharing out of my workspace. Not only are we allowing the entire sales and marketing department to view this content, we've also allowed the reshare so that anybody in sales and marketing can turn around and share this report with however they see fit, meaning it's sitting in my workspace and somebody else can turn around and share it out. And maybe that's fine, but this to me feels like risk and the kind of thing that you want to relocate over to a standard workspace. All right. Let me check and see. I see a couple of questions. Thank you for posting them for me. What would be the best approach to govern individual user permissions, mainly for write and build permissions? And so when we're talking about write and build, we are back to an actual data set. And that's where my preference for who can edit this data set right here. By the way, I'm in a data workspace, right? That means the purpose here is to house data sets and data flows, meaning every single report you see here is only data set documentation, change log, that kind of stuff. They are not quote unquote real reports, maybe data quality reports, that sort of thing. So that's a quick aside. Anyways, managing this kind of data set, my first choice at the workspace level, because it's impacting the set. Second choice is that write permission on the individual data set. The build permission though, it's only a individual per item thing. So it's inherited from people who can edit the content. But that situation where we have our report creators, they're in another workspace, we want to give them read and build on a data set in this workspace, we got to give them build at the individual level. Because if we gave them viewer on the data workspace, that doesn't come along with build. So we do end up having to deal with per item at the data set level. Even if we don't want to, we have to. The other question about apps, I'm going to hang on because we're going to hit apps here in just a second. But the short answer to your question is that 100% when you can use groups instead of individuals, especially with apps, especially with workspaces. Sharing, it's less common, right? But even then too, if you can pull it off. All right, so let's wrap up this section with kind of just pulling together a few particular things. One, when is this per item sharing most useful? Well, we want to allow access to only one item. I should probably change this because, of course, build and all that. Usually we think of sharing as a report sharing. Technically, it comes along for the data set. But from a report perspective, you want to allow read-only access to just that one report, for instance, because you don't want them to view everything in the workspace, or you don't want them to view everything in the app. And that is why I always think of sharing as an exception to workspace roles. Same idea with files and folders on a file system, right? When we start breaking the folder level security and setting thing on a file level, yeah, of course it's going to get more tedious and error prone. Same exact idea. Sharing from your personal workspace, same thing, access to one item. Because it's non-critical, right? It's appropriate to be in your personal workspace, and it's just something that you do thoughtfully and sparingly. So it has its place. It just shouldn't be the default way that a self-service BI user does everything. And that's sadly the case where people find themselves sometimes in their first few months of a Power BI journey. So watch out for when you do use per item sharing a lot. That means if you need to make a change across a whole bunch of items, it can be tedious, and especially if individuals are used instead of groups. It's very, very common that the use of individuals is overused. Even that pending workflow that can only work on an individual sort of even encourages that, right? Overuse of reshare, it's on by default. So a lot of times we're in a rush, right? We want to share something, we go, and that thing is on by default. So watch too much sharing from personal workspaces, that default people in your organization sharing link that is too broad. Two things on that, right? One is if you use row level security, that is your secondary layer of defense to this. There's also an API that I can look it up later if somebody's interested, but it looks for organization-wide sharing or something like that. That's not exactly the name of it. It looks for those oversharing situations and tells you, when has this been done? And then you can basically audit that and make sure that if you do need to leave it enabled, you can audit it on a regular basis and make sure that it's used when you want it to be used. Watch out for allowing build on a data set when it isn't necessary. So a lot of times, if you're just a consumer of a report, you only need read on that data set. You don't need build. Same exact idea with that new write permission. It's called modify on the user interface. A true consumer doesn't need it. If you are a content creator and you need to create new reports, absolutely assign the build permission. All righty, that moves us on to apps. This is kind of an exciting demo because if you've heard, we've got some new goodies in apps. So let me go back to my Sales Analytics workspace. And I'm going to go up here to the Update App button. And this setup page looks pretty similar to how it always has been, but this gives us a good way to give it a support site, assign the contact, what the nice logo is, the description, etc. All right. And then we can say which pieces of content from the workspace end up in the app. So in this case, I have said there are 4 items from the workspace that should be in the app. This is, by the way, that new experience that just landed earlier this month. So it's still in preview at this point. Really kind of nice. You can see a nice little preview if you're trying to figure out what should I add to the app. This is the replacement for that little yes, no toggle that's over in the workspace that we've had for a long time. So we have 4 reports that could potentially be exposed in this app. All right, here's where the really fun part begins. Now we have audiences. So I have defined a sales leadership audience, and all 4, actually technically this is 3 reports and a URL, this sales KPIs. It goes out to a SharePoint site that defines what the KPIs are. It's a nice thing to do in an app, to add nice links to other resources that go well with your content. But anyway, the sales leadership can see all 4 items here in the app. But if I go to the sales reps audience, notice that the profitability, the gross margin analysis, they don't get to see that. So here's the deal. What that allows us to do now is essentially say, I still have a one workspace to one app relationship, but I can mix and match which things in the app, the content that is, with which target audiences. So if you have found yourself in a situation in the past where you have published the same report to 2 or 3 workspaces, for instance, merely for the purpose of having this different combination of things for your app, because of the one app to one workspace relationship, if you found yourself doing that before, this will solve that. All right, so how do you correctly add a new report to the app in this new experience? Yeah, it's a little bit different, and I would expect we're going to see this get refined as the preview progresses. But if we go back to the content page, and then there's a little drop down here. So I could say, oh, wait, maybe that's not it. Oh, yep, sorry, not the drop down, just the actual button. I feel like I do that every time. And so we can see that there are, maybe I want to add, these ones here and go ahead and add them. So one thing that is different now, and I actually like it, if something new gets added to the workspace, easy for me to say, right? You literally have to add it, because it used to be that little yes, no flag, the yes is on by default for new stuff in a workspace. So it would be really easy to accidentally republish your app. But now you literally have to click the button, choose it, and add it. And I kind of like that, being able to be a little bit more careful with what ends up in the app. All right. So now that you've seen that, our best use for an app is broad content distribution scenarios. So think larger number of people or a more formal situation, right? And my favorite example of that is we have 150 sales reps throughout the entire world. We have a set of reports that we need to release to all of them, right? That's a formal distribution scenario, right? That's very different than, oh, the 3 people that I work with and we share some reports. So that's what I mean, this additional formality or the extra layer of an app. So we have separate permissions, and we just saw how they were defined with the audiences in there. So the big thing to know about this is that when you publish an app, you are always publishing the content and the app permissions together. There's one exception to that, if anybody's interested. But when you hit that publish app button, the risk that you have is, I'll come back to that. The risk that you have is that data set changes always immediately take effect. So if you have somebody say, oh yeah, I can be changing this report in the workspace and consumers of the app won't see it until I republish the report, that is true. But it's not true for data set changes. And we really like that behavior for, say, data set refresh. But if you are making changes to a data set in the workspace, you can absolutely break the production app. So with the permissions, since when we hit publish app, permissions and the content always go together, know that, oh shoot, if I'm using users instead of groups, then I need to publish the app to add this new person, but uh-oh, I have 3 report changes that are mid-flight and not really ready to go. You got yourself a problem. And usually that's when you start saying, all right, I need a separation of my dev workspace from my prod workspace. That is usually the solution. Or changes just don't ever leave desktop and get published to the service. You can still make this work up to a certain point. Just because I teased it, let me cancel those. If I go to my apps menu, no, not metrics, apps. So I said a second ago, when you publish, the content and the permissions always go together. All right. If I had, doesn't really matter which one I use, do I have any? Here's a manage permissions for this sales analytics app. If I had any pending permissions here, the same thing that we demoed earlier, right? Remember when Scotty looked at the URL, he sent the request, we saw it on the pending page. That was sharing of a report. Same conceptual thing happens for an app though, right? And it would land here. The really interesting thing is that if I approve a pending request here, it does update the permissions without updating the content. So that's our one little exception to what I said a minute ago about them always going together. All right, so agreed. I've seen the question a couple times now. 100% agreed that the best thing that you can do is these audiences, their groups instead of individuals. So that will prevent you ever needing to republish an app just to change security. And it means that, you have one place to change security, especially if that group is used for multiple things. So 100% agreed with that. So watch out for, we just totally talked about this particular thing. All right. Row level security, we are almost to the end. This is a really quick one. We're not going to do any demos. We're just going to talk conceptually here for just a second to make sure you're aware of what you can do. Let's say we have 2 populations of people, same exact report and same exact underlying data set, but they need to see different data. They might need to see different customers or different regions or different employees. Instead of keeping 2 data sets and 2 reports, there are people that will do that because they don't realize that this is a possibility. That's an excellent use case for row level security. So this is simplified, but what happens is you define your RLS roles in Power BI Desktop. Let me add an asterisk to that. For a data set, if you're developing a data mart now, RLS is defined in the service. And I have not addressed data marts here for this. So let's say you create a rule that you want to filter Europe sales data. You publish that to the service, and then you'd have to set up mappings for that role up in the service. Basically, which users and groups are allowed to see that Europe sales data. Then, and here's really the key point that I'm driving at, then these rules are invoked on the model. People get confused all the time because most of the time you see the effect of row-level security when you're running a report. But what's really making row-level security work is that underlying data set. So as long as the person can only read that underlying data set, including build, but if they have write or anything higher, row-level security is ignored. So there's a couple different kinds of row-level security that's dynamic and static, and we're not going to talk about any of that. I really just want you to know that they're invoked on the data set, even though it appears so to most people, like it's invoked on the reports. So let's talk about default behavior, because here's the other big thing that I want you to walk away with. So let's say you've got your viewers, your consumers that only have read-only permissions. So we have data set 1. We're going to create the row-level security in desktop. And we know that it's invoked in the service only. It's never invoked in desktop, right? You can test it, but it's not invoked for a real consumer. So let's say data set 1 has no RLS roles defined whatsoever. What happens when that data set is published to the service? Anybody who's allowed to view that data set, via a report or whatever, as long as they've got read permissions on the data set, they will see all of the data in the entire data set because there's no row-level security on it, right? So they see the entire data set. So let's say we have data set 2 on the right, which has at least one RLS role defined. So what happens then is the exact opposite experience. When that gets published to the service, the viewers of that one see no data in the data set unless they're in an RLS role. So when you hear me say something like, oh, we have this extra layer of security if RLS at least exists, this on the right is exactly what we mean. So some people like to create a role that's really just like view all data, for instance. And, oops, sorry. There we go. Something like view all data. And that forces someone viewing the content to be in a role to be able to view it. So when we talked earlier about that sharing link that provides organization-wide access to a report, if you were using RLS here, that would be your second layer of defense. All right, just to round out the conversation, the previous one was viewers. Now we're talking about editors. So people that have permission in the workspace to these data sets, it doesn't matter. Both situations, the people that can edit the content can always see all of the data, right? It doesn't matter. So that thing we talked about before with exact opposite only applies to the viewers. All right, if static RLS works, use it. If it gets really complicated and crazy, that's a good sign to start looking into dynamic RLS. And when you can, try to keep RLS the same as who can read the data set or who can view the content in the workspace, right? It's when you have these mismatches that people get something unexpected happen. So again, groups to the rescue here. We've talked a lot about that last one. So, all right, here's the last little bit, the last few final thoughts that we have. So most of this isn't going to be a surprise, but let's just distill a few of our things. What kind of permissions do you need? So first of all, if you need to edit content, you're talking about a workspace permission. If you need to read content, if it's official or formal, and it includes several items that are packaged up together, this idea of an app is really a great solution. And it's the best user experience because we've got the nice menu on the side. We've got additional links we can add, right? It's just a nicer experience than the workspace viewer role. How many reports and dashboards are we going to allow to be viewed? If it's everything in a workspace, okay, let's go ahead and use the workspace viewer roles. If it's a less formal situation, they can see everything in it. Okay, use it. If it's only one specific item, that's when we want to think about that sharing links or the direct access sharing when the first two don't suffice. So my suggestion usually is to look at per item sharing as your third choice, not your first choice. And that's usually the exact opposite of what most people do in Power BI, at least until they've gotten more experienced with how to distribute content in the org. Thinking about your audience, and I need to rephrase that since we now have audiences in apps. Thinking about your types of users, we shall say. Large teams, broad distribution apps are usually your best choice, or at least the first thing I want you to look at, right? Rule of thumb, adjust then when that doesn't work for you. Small teams, either a workspace or an app, depends on if you want to bother with the additional layer of an app. Sometimes the extra set of permissions and specifically choosing which content is a fantastic advantage and gives you great flexibility. And sometimes it might just be an extra hassle you don't need. The per item sharing, if you don't want them to see everything in the workspace or the app. If you're not exactly sure who your audience is, a template app in your organization might be a useful choice. Like maybe you've got the safety metrics for the org, right? And just anybody who is interested in it can go fetch that app, something like that. Workspace versus app permissions. Again, these are just rules of thumb as where to start with. Workspace permissions usually are limited to who's doing authoring or validations, testing, etc. I would add deployments in there too. Usually those are reserved for only your read-only consumers because the permissions are always view-only. So in most cases, you wouldn't have a lot of overlap between your app users and your workspace users. But know this, if you have workspace permissions of any type, any of the four roles, you can always see an app if an app exists. But if you have app permissions, you would have to have specific workspace permissions as well to see that. So most of the time for your app users, you just kind of hide the workspace stuff from them if they don't need it. So you just heard me say this. First choice, apps. Second choice, workspace viewer. Third choice, per item sharing. Again, we're just talking viewers here, not editors. So this is just me being super duper explicit for anybody that downloads the slides. Just to recap, our data authors, we can manage their permissions up in that workspace. Report authors, we can manage it with their workspace role on that workspace and then build on the data set up in the data workspace. We talked earlier about all of those advantages. That build permission is critical. Not only does it allow you to create new reports, lets you use Analyze in Excel. So that's basically a live Excel connection rather than an export. So that's a way we really like to use Excel with Power BI. Or if you want to use some other tool, and if this is sitting in a premium or PPU workspace, and you want to connect to the XMLA endpoint from some other tool, the build permission also allows all of these kinds of things. So getting that build permission on the data set can be directly granted on the data set. It's also indirectly granted when sharing. So we saw earlier that link that was existing on the data set that was a result of the report share. It can also be granted when you're publishing an app or those workspace roles. So this is kind of a essentially an inheritance situation almost. So we started out by talking about our multiple layers of security. So workspace roles and apps whenever possible, right? Per item permissions when we need to. And then that third layer of defense with row level security that we can do that on data sets and data marts really is a great way to provide some additional levels of assurances that the right people are seeing this data. All right. So we talked way at the beginning about this being the primary purpose for each. So hopefully that's very clear now. This diagram is on my website. It actually needs a couple of updates and that I haven't had a chance to get to yet. I haven't added the dataset right permission. I haven't added a reference to the app audience. And I think the goals or the metrics needs a little tweaking as well. But if you're looking for, other than those newer things that I haven't gotten to yet, if you're looking for a bit of a summary of, I have a self-service author, what kind of permissions are they probably going to take responsibility for managing? That's the goal for this particular diagram. All right, let's see. I see a question about DMVs. Oh, I don't know the answer. So the answer is about some of the TM schema column permissions and table permissions, and that the DMVs apply to analysis services and some of the dynamic management views that are exposed for a Power BI data set are exposed because that data set really is just an analysis services model under the covers. So some DMVs are exposed. The ones that you're referencing specifically about permissions, I don't know the answer to what the plans are for those. So sorry about that. All right, the next question is dealing with sensitive data. How can we limit the data that can be seen with Analyze in Excel? I think I would rely on all the exact same techniques, right? So access to the data set, and how are they getting access to the data set? Row level security on the data set. I would not rely on a perspective as true security, right? It could be used to narrow down what is seen in Excel as a convenience, but it's just part of the connection string, right? It's just a convenience. If somebody went in and monkeyed with it, they would still be able to see the whole model. So I would not rely on that as a actual security tactic. So whether you're using a Power BI report or Excel, I wouldn't change the security techniques. All right, so that's everything I had prepared. I had predicted we would go an hour and 15 minutes, and it's an hour and 18 minutes, so I did pretty good. But any additional questions that we want to handle before we wrap it all up?
Yeah, Melissa, thank you for the great session. We had a lot of questions today. Thank you for posting your questions. So looks like we have answered all of them. If we missed anything, just let us know. But looks like we are out of questions.
Okay.
Yep. Melissa, thank you for being with us today. So such sessions, it's very important for us to complete the marathon with adding with every session. And during the session, we are collecting funds for our Marines, yeah, and our soldiers, defenders who are defending our country in the in very hot places, and they need that equipment that we are collecting funds for. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for everyone who joined us today, and I hope to see everyone very soon in Ukraine, free of invaders, and we can do that with your help. So our soldiers are very strong, but they need equipment like copters and a lot of other stuff. Yeah, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for organizing it. You guys are amazing. Good job.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who helped like organizing all that, coming during every session. And we have 2 additional weeks on 2 additional days, sorry, on Wednesday and Thursday. So see you tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.